Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to Andy and Bridget and the whole staff here at the American Revolution Institute. It is a great honor to be here. I'm absolutely tickled pink. I got here and I'm going to talk in Washington D.C. I naturally thought I was going to be talking. When I imagined it, I thought I would be at the National Press Club. I think this is better. I think this is a better room. So thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for everybody who's watching virtually. And my mic is in the right spot. Yes. Okay, great. All right. Here is a story I want to tell you about the American Revolution. In July 1776, Jonas Phillips wrote a letter and put a copy of the Declaration of Independence along with that letter in an envelope and shipped it off to relatives in Europe in violation of British law. So Phillips, to hide what he was doing, wrote in Yiddish. And he sent the letter to the Netherlands by the roundabout way of the Caribbean. Phillips is very bullish on the revolution. He said the war would free America, in part because the Americans have an army of 100,000 Rukum. Rukum is Yiddish for tough guys. The British captured the letter, didn't know what to make of it, thought it was written in code. And so it sat in the British archives for many, many, many years. This is not the only time Yiddish has been used to describe the crisis between Britain and the United States. In 1770, the Pennsylvanian Barnard Gratz wrote to a friend, "I was going to enclose to you the king's speech to Parliament, but it was such Narishkeit, it's not worth the postage." Narishkeit is Yiddish for nonsense. The Jews of the American Revolution are almost as cryptic as these Yiddish references. The subject almost sounds more like this is Borscht Belt comedy shtick than serious history. But I would like to take this opportunity to make the case that it is serious history and that there are good reasons for us to pay attention to it, both as people who enjoy, have hobbies in the American Revolution, and also as American citizens generally. Again, Jews are participating in the revolution, not just in the army. On May 17th, 1776, Gershom Satius, head of Shearith Israel, New York's only synagogue, organized a day of fasting and prayer as recommended by Congress. The proclamation from Congress had been specifically drafted for Christian clergy. So Satius was not under any obligation to do anything. But he led the Jews in worship anyway, asking God to put it in the heart of our sovereign Lord George III to turn away their fierce wrath from North America. And Satius called upon the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But otherwise, this was the Patriot prayer suggested by the Congressional Proclamation. Essentially, Satius turned the synagogue into an extension of Congress. He made the Synagogue of New York a patriot space. American Jews, Satius wrote, should view themselves as possessing equal rights and privileges with the rest of the inhabitants. Satius soon led the patriot Jews out of New York. As the British bore down on the city, Satius gathered up the Torah and other ritual objects and crossed the East River with his fellow patriot Jews, creating what is almost certainly Connecticut's first minyan. They would rather live there than live under Tory rule. In 1780, Satius and his followers went to Philadelphia, where he became the religious leader of the first national American Jewish community. The revolution had rabbis. Why should we care about this? Well, the revolution has sometimes, for a long time, been described as sort of a Christian or a pseudo-Christian affair. Some people have dedicated themselves to the idea that America had a Christian founding, and therefore that Christianity is was and is incorporated into American law and policy. I maintain this argument is more often asserted than proven. When people talk about this, it sort of begins with the notion that certain founding fathers were religious Christians, and that's true. And from there argues that because of that, Protestant interests and theologies were the paramount reasons why people fought for the revolution. In other words, this idea begins with the presence of Christian patriots to assert the false conclusion that all patriots were Christians and therefore fought for Christianity. It makes it seem as if what mattered in the revolution was religious conviction, that what made a patriot was Protestant faith. But it was not so. Some patriots used words like Narishkeit and Rookum. The idea that only Protestants are fighting in the revolution and that religious pluralism develops later is false. The deeper problem are these sort of these schools of thought is that they're sort of limiting the experience of the revolution to the experience of religion. It's an argument that Protestant ideologies and theologies are the paramount reasons why people fought for the revolution. And these questions bother me because they essentially say that if you have faith, then you have patriotism. This has modern political ramifications, but the most concerning I find is the idea that Christian faith is somehow the essence of the American citizen, and the rights of Jews, Muslims, Catholics, and other religious faiths are later accretions that can somehow be wiped away because they weren't there at the very beginning. Well, we need another way to talk about religion and the revolution, not only to answer this question, but also so we don't project our modern ideas about religious secular divides, evangelical mainline divides. We don't want to project those back into the past. We don't want to think, we want to avoid the error of thinking about American Christianity as this unchanging, has an unchanging nature, or the idea that revolutionary America is some kind of Eden. And I think the Jewish experience has a lot to offer here. The largest group of the predominantly white non-Christians in the revolution are the Jews. And therefore they served as a test case in the 1770s and 1780s. A test case. If this really was a Christian nation, and if the revolution was a Christian event, Jews would have been disallowed. If they weren't thrown out of the army, then certainly we would expect the pre-revolutionary restrictions on religious faith and citizenship to continue after the war. But that's not what happened. Religious diversity was baked into the American founding. And what is more, religious freedom comes from the American founding. It is a clear case where we can say there are rights for people that exist after the revolution that did not exist before the revolution. It is at least a case where we can look at this one particular case. This is where freedoms actually do increase in a real way. And that's often news to evangelicals, mainline Christians, secular Americans, and Jews themselves. The great scholar of Jewish history, Jonathan Sarna, once wrote, "Jews gained their religious rights in the United States as individuals along with everybody else." That does sort of depend on who we mean by everybody else. But another way of putting this that is a little more anti-Semitic comes from Mark Twain, who once said, "In the United States, the Jew was created free in the beginning. He did not need to help, of course." And of course, this is an old anti-Semitic canard, Jewish parasite. So I want to explore a little bit how Jews actually played a role in creating their own rights in America. And I think that has serious bearing on sort of Jewish history, but also our discourse about the founding, about American citizenship, and indeed about our own 21st century's high tide of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So let's take a moment here to actually review Jewish participation in the revolution and how that created religious freedom. And on the plus side, it's actually an amazing story. The first thing I want to talk about is are Jews in the army. A number about 70, 80 years ago, there was a Nobel Prize winning physicist named Arno Penzias, and he was writing about his experience growing up in Brooklyn. And he says, yeah, there was a Jewish guy in the revolution. It was Chaim Solomon, who they talked about as the Jewish guy, the Jewish founding father. And Penzias pointed out, he's like, this is clearly the consolation prize for the Jewish kids, because, of course, the Jews got the banker of the revolution, which, as Penzias points out, did not like really fend off anti-Semitic stereotypes. But as Penzias says, it was taken for granted by everybody, including us, I'm afraid, that Jews just didn't make good soldiers. And again, what is fascinating to think about when we think about Jews who volunteer to serve in the American forces in the Revolution, no Jewish family in Europe has a revolutionary tradition, has a military tradition, excuse me, because Jews cannot serve as officers in European armies. Remember, all the European states are connected to churches. All of the nations, all of the monarchies of Europe are not just political organizations, they are religious organizations. Therefore, the British Army is not just the army of the King of Great Britain, it is also an army for the Church of England. The church and the army are melded together. Therefore, you can't have a Jewish officer over Christian troops. But given the chance to fight, Jews signed up. And the Patriots go with it. They accept them. Some examples: Solomon Bush in Philadelphia is wounded and becomes a colonel during the war. He suffers a leg wound in 1777 and he's captured by the British. That was a mistake because he's in occupied Philadelphia and he functions as a spy, sending information about what's going on behind the lines to General Washington. In 1776, Hart Jacobs is serving guard in New York and informs the New York Committee of Safety that he cannot perform guard duty on Friday nights because it is part of the Jewish Sabbath. The committee exempts Jacobs from military duty on Friday nights, and Jacobs stood guard the rest of the week. There was a guy named Elias Pollock who was afraid that his origins would disqualify him, so he signed up under the name Joseph Smith. Philip Moses Russell served with Bush at Brandywine and becomes a surgeon's mate at Valley Forge. There he survives an attack of the camp fever, the result of his incessant attention to the wounded and sick, which impaired his vision as well as hearing. Moses Meyer became a major in the Virginia militia, finished the war at Yorktown. And at the Battle of Beaufort, there was one militia which was known as the Jew Company, because 28 of its 40 members were Jewish. But the Jew Company didn't call themselves the Jew Company. They called themselves the Free Citizens, which suggests to me what they were fighting for in the Revolution. And these are just my favorite examples. Again, Jews serve, this is the important part, Jews serve in the army in direct proportion to their numbers in the population, about 1/10 of 1%. So tiny, tiny number. We have about 14, 15 officers who are Jewish during the Revolution. Again, a tiny percent, but again, they serve in proportion to their numbers in the population. And this is from a group that, again, has no family traditions of service and who, prior to the Revolution, would not have been allowed to achieve officer status, to sort of make a career of the military. And that's really remarkable. Washington and the other Patriot generals seem to have promoted Jews simply along with all other white Patriot soldiers. They did not keep record. Elias Pollock didn't need to change his name. He didn't know that. But he didn't need to change his name to Joseph Smith because the U.S. Army wasn't keeping track of the religion of the people who fought. And that in itself is a really remarkable development. Again, so Jews are there. They are serving as soldiers. They are serving as officers. They are fighting along with their Gentile patriot brethren. What about other leaders? What about political and social leaders? Some of you may have heard of Mordecai Sheftall of Georgia. He's a patriot, Jewish guy in Savannah. He becomes the chairman of what is called the Parochial Committee in 1775 in Savannah. The Parochial Committee, these are the committees that are sort of spontaneous patriot organizations that begin acting like governments in defiance of the British. As British control over areas declines, the Parochial Committee becomes the de facto government. So the Parochial Committee enforces embargoes. It does, quote, whatever it thought needed doing for Savannah, which at one point included appointing a local Anglican priest when the assigned loyalist pastor fled town. And that's a little bit odd because the head of the Parochial Committee is Mordecai Sheftall. Mordecai Sheftall would not have been able to wield any kind of this power under British rule because of something called test oaths. A test oath is where one has to affirm one's belief in something. Some has to make some sort of religious confession to serve in public office. So again, and all of the colonies and states have test oaths, depending on where you are. One sometimes has to take an oath on belief in the New Testament. Sometimes you have to take a more Protestant oath. You have to, I believe in the New Testament, and I do not believe in following any foreign potentates, which is how they get Catholics not to take the oath. All sorts of, but you have to swear on the Bible that you believe in the Christian religion in some way, shape, or form. Sheftall would not have been able to take that oath, so he cannot, by definition, have any of this power in British Savannah. But what are the Patriots doing? They are overthrowing the British crown and British law. And therefore, the test oaths go away as well. So no oaths are needed. And I think this is an important point because, again, it is the British law that says you must take this oath. You must be a Christian to serve in any position of authority, to be, in fact, a citizen. And the Patriots just get rid of that. And Mordecai Sheftall is the guy the Patriots want in charge of Savannah, so he gets to do it. Doesn't have to take a test oath. The royal governor of Georgia, James Wright, also found this to be peculiar and upsetting. He noted the rise of one Sheftall, a Jew, as a particularly ominous development in the colony. When the British recapture Savannah in 1778 and Wright again becomes governor, Sheftall is captured and arrested. And Wright bans all other Jews from entering the colony. He says, one thing we're definitely going to do is we're going to stop any Jews from coming into Savannah. And Wright claimed he was not anti-Semitic. He just used the words bigots always use when these things happen. He said, "The times, my lord, require these exertions. It's not my fault I have to ban Jews from coming into Georgia. They're just such terrible people. There's nothing else I could possibly do." Something similar happened to the Jews of St. Eustatius, which is this tiny little dot of an island in the Caribbean. But it has a Jewish population, and actually, support for the American cause is very strong among the Jews of St. Eustatius as well. It's a Dutch colony. In 1777, the British seize an illegal cargo off the coast of Maryland. Paperwork aboard indicates that all of the supplies intended for Patriots come from Jewish merchants in St. Eustatius. One of the Sheriff Israel Patriots who went from New York into Connecticut, a guy named Samson Mears, relocates to St. Eustatius and organize black market supplies for the Patriots. When the Patriot Jews of Philadelphia later are petitioning for legal recognition of their rights, they specifically mention the patriotic community of St. Eustatius along with the other communities in North America. Eustatius is the only Jewish community outside the 13 states that is so mentioned. Why do I bring this up? Because St. Eustatius's good times end when British declare war on the Netherlands, and Admiral Rodney invades the island in February 1781. The island had 60 Dutch soldiers. Rodney had 3,000 and 15 warships. So there's not a big fight. Rodney takes the island, and again, his objective is to sabotage the black market trade. Rodney therefore dubs the capture of the island and all of the people on the island as an action against piracy, not as an act of war. And as outlaws, pirates are not covered by the rules of war, and Rodney takes advantage of this legal fiction. The British ransack the island, and on taking control, Rodney does several unpleasant things, one of which is he orders all the Jews of St. Eustatius rounded up and expelled. He later explained that they cannot be too soon taken care of. They are notorious in the cause of America and France. The Jewish men of St. Eustatius were informed they had one day to prepare for exile. They could not take any goods or family members. They are collected in a weighing house. They are stripped of their clothing, which was then cut up so that every, quote, every shilling of money could be confiscated. In the end, only 30 of the men were deported to St. Kitts, and the rest are sort of released from the warehouse to discover their personal goods were being auctioned off by British forces. News of this action reaches the floor of Parliament, where nobody less than the Edmund Burke condemns the attack on Statia, especially Rodney's, quote, aggravated cruelty inflicted upon the Jews while they remained in the Weigh House. So fun fact, Rodney has to go back to London to face a court-martial. As a consequence, Admiral Rodney is not there to lead the interception of the French fleet under the command of Francois-Joseph de Grasse in September, and a less seasoned captain leads the British response and loses. De Grasse, after that victory, is then able to sail on to blockade Cornwallis at Yorktown and therefore allow Washington to trap the British army against the sea. The future British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne complained at the time that he solemnly believed the capture of Lord Cornwallis was owing to the capture of St. Eustatius. Now, I would not go so far as to say American victory at Yorktown depended upon an anti-Semitic outburst by Britain. That's probably taking it a little too far. But I ask you to compare the way Britain tried to respond to its religious minorities versus the way the Patriots responded to their religious minorities. Again, Washington and the Patriots, by and large, bring the Jews into the fight. They treat them as equal members of this fighting force. The British, at times, expel the Jews. Again, I don't want to give the impression, this is not a universal British policy. It's not a crown policy, but it is what happens in Georgia and St. Eustatius. Moreover, again, the same thing happens, a parallel development is happening with Catholicism, which is to say that the Americans invite the Catholics of America to join the cause. There is no division made between Protestants and Catholics in the American army. Meanwhile, in Britain, there is an attempt to recognize Catholicism as part of the British state government in 1780 that results in the famous Gordon riots. Again, and that is buried. So again, Britain does not find a way to recognize its religious minorities or include them or give them rights. They lose. America does, and they win. And let me tell you a little bit about the Patriot Synagogue while I'm on the subject here. Most America, there's sort of an accident of war and geography that makes a big difference here, because American Jews largely, not exclusively, but largely they live in 5 cities: Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, Savannah. By 1780, all of those cities, except Philadelphia, have been occupied by the British. So exiled Jewish patriots have only one place to go worship: Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the only city left standing in America that has a functioning synagogue. So from 1779 to 1783, Philadelphia gets all of the Jewish refugees who can afford to get there. Philadelphia hosts a Jewish community from across the colonies, unified more probably in political ideology than by common liturgy, which is to say there are many different liturgies represented in this new Philadelphia synagogue. But what are they doing there? They're all patriots. The loyalist Jews stay home. In 1782, Philadelphia's synagogue, Mikvah Israel, was refounded with a governing board staffed by Jews from across the nation, which is to say they bring in a Hazan, a leader. Technically there's no rabbis, they're just Hazans. If you want me to get into the technical details, I certainly can. But the leader of the services, the person who's leading up worship, is Gershom Satius from New York. The president of the synagogue is from Georgia. They bring in board members from Philadelphia and from Charleston, and there's even one guy from New Orleans who comes in, and they form a national board, a national organization to recreate their congregation. It is an unabashedly national patriotic congregation of Jews in the nation's capital, just a few blocks from Independence Hall, which may explain why the Patriot leader Benjamin Rush later wrote, "The Jews in all the states were Whigs," that is, patriots. In an organizational sense, American Judaism owes its origin to the Revolution. The Patriot Jews worked and lived together in this single Philadelphia community, founded a synagogue, and when the war ends, they return home and they remake their own synagogues in the image of Mikvah Israel. Every American synagogue in the 1780s is led by a patriot who spent time in Mikvah Israel, which is to say that the leadership of all the other synagogues in America falls to people who spent time at Mikvah Israel. American Patriot Jews lead all of the synagogues. So structurally, therefore, we might say the American Revolution had greater immediate impact on Judaism than perhaps on any other religious group in America. Judaism may well have been the first truly national American religion, again, in an organizational sense. And they did not simply stop at religious reforms, they also sought political reforms. In the wake of the war, Gershom Satius and a group from Mikvah Israel, this is a very interesting group at Mikvah Israel. Anyone who has spent any time in a synagogue will know that, spoiler alert, sometimes synagogues have divisions within them and people have arguments. This happens with other groups too. I think synagogues talk about it more than the Baptists do, but that's not a historical fact. That's just been my experience living in Alabama. Remember Jonas Phillips, the guy who sends the Declaration of Independence and the letter saying that the Americans are full of Rookham, the army's full of Rookham. He's there too. He and Satius are absolutely at each other's throats the whole time they're together. They never stop complaining, but they both serve on a committee together. And the job of that committee in 1783 is to consult all of the constitutions that have been written, all the new state constitutions from all of the new states, and to look at the Articles of Confederation. No constitution yet. So they buy a copy and they go through it, and you can still see their notation. If you go to the Rosenbach Museum and Library, they still have this document where they make notations about, okay, what are the rights of Jews in each of the states? Where are we full citizens and where are we not? And they begin to sort of think about how do we ensure that we will get our full citizenship rights? And sort of from that work, and again, I do think it's significant that, again, these two guys who hated each other, and a bunch of other people too, were able to agree on, okay, well, we need to petition for full rights. In 1783, they write to the Pennsylvania Council of Censors. The Pennsylvania Council of Censors at the time is the body charged with making revisions to the Pennsylvania Constitution. And Mikvah Israel specifically asked the censors to seek a change in the state's test oath, which required office holders to be Christians, and explained their argument this way. The Jews of Charleston, New York, Newport, and other posts occupied by British troops have distinguishedly suffered for their attachment to the Revolution principles. The Jews of Pennsylvania can count with any religious society whatsoever, the Whigs among any of them. They have served, some of them, in the Continental Army. Some went out with the militia to fight the common enemy. All of them have cheerfully contributed to the support of the militia and the government of the state. In other words, they were claiming that the revolutionary experience, patriot service, made them full citizens. In other words, they did not ask for the law to be changed because they thought it was a bad law. They asked for it to be changed because they had already achieved those rights. They spoke as Americans who already had the right to serve in office, again, as full citizens. Not just the right to worship freely, but the right to be a citizen, the right to be a part of the body politic. Though the Council of Censors does not act in 1783, as the Jews of Mikvah Israel go home, test oaths and state churches fall in every state with a synagogue. New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, all get rid of their testos and their state churches by 1792, which is significant. Everywhere it would have mattered, it goes away. State churches only remain in places where there are no white citizens organized in a synagogue. That is to say, any place where a Christian-only government would have presented a problem to an organized religion, That's where they remain. And anywhere where the Jews raise their hand and say, what about us? What about religious freedom? What about citizenship rights? They fall. I think the way in which this revolutionary experience, this Patriot service, sort of creates this kind of religious freedom, and I should point out, Jews are not the only groups doing this. Catholics, Baptists are doing this as well. But I also think it then shaped Jewish responses to anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish prejudice in the new nation. And this was most clear in the effort Georgia's effort to remove its state test oath. At the war's end, 1784, there was a publication. Georgia is thinking about getting rid of its test oaths, and then there came a publication called Cursory Remarks on Men and Measures in Georgia. Cursory Remarks on Men and Measures in Georgia is an anonymous work, which is a series of political complaints packaged around a candy center of anti-Semitism. The author remains unknown only by the pseudonym A. Citizen. I'm going to spend a little time. This is not the only example, but I'm going to spend just a little time with this to illustrate the things that I think are important about the Jewish experience and Jewish citizenship in the early republic. The Citizen, author of this tract, claimed that Georgia was under threat, and that the threat to Georgia was that it tolerated Jews and allowed them political power. Indeed, the Citizen was upset that a recent court case involving Mordecai Sheftall had found in a 2-1 decision that Jews had standing in U.S. courts. And Men and Measures then launches into an extensive discussion of how Jews are parasites feeding off the governments. They're a political threat for, quote, Jews nowadays enter very little into politics, farther than to favor that system which is most promotive of their pecuniary interest, the principle of lucre being the life and soul of their actions. It mentions medieval legends of the blood libel. It argues that no English law ever specifically allowed Jews to claim civil rights, and therefore Jews didn't have civil rights in Georgia because, of course, all the English laws were still in place. The author of Men and Measures ignores the fact that, like, the Americans kicked him out. But I go on. He actually, the Men and Measures calls the United States a Christian country and specifically says no Jew can become citizens but by the aid of the legislature in this Christian country. What are we to expect but to have Christianity enacted into a capital heresy if Jews are allowed to even volunteer on public occasions? And then finally, there's the kicker, the thing that really makes it sound like it was written yesterday on an alt-right site. The author claims that he is not prejudiced. I am as far removed from being a votary or friend of persecution as any man on earth. And he even talks about he has Jewish friends, one whole family of upright demeanor. Now, that's all I want to talk about that guy. But I want to talk about the response. The more important is the response. It was Levi Sheftall, Mordecai's half-brother, who writes a public response to Men and Measures and publishes it in the Georgia Gazette, January 1785. Levi Sheftall's response is much, much shorter. Men and Measures is about 30 pages. Levi writes a couple paragraphs. In his response, he leaves aside every issue except the issue of citizenship. He is not drawn into all of the canards and all of the insults that are offered to him. Instead, he writes, the author of this tract, the author of Men and Measures, subscribes himself a citizen. But Levi says, what about the Jew who was particularly alluded to, that is to say, Mordecai Sheftall? What has this Jew done that he should not also be entitled to the rights of citizenship? And then Levi lists the patriotic services Mordecai Sheftall renders Georgia in the Revolution, including having his property seized, serving on the parochial committee, leading the parochial committee. He is imprisoned for refusing to reveal the location of Patriot gunpowder and, as became a faithful citizen, discharging the several trusts reposed in him. Whether or not such a man and the rest of his profession in the state, that is to say, all Jews, should not have the same rights as a citizen, I leave it to the Whigs, the Patriots, to judge. There's a lot going on here. Levi was calling out the author, but what's interesting is that even though the citizen who wrote Men and Measures wrote a lot of questions, what's the nature of the Jew? What's the nature of the law? What's the nature of the Christian community? What's the nature of a gentleman? The response doesn't do a point-by-point rebuttal. For a real citizen, there's only one point that cuts through everything else. And Levi Sheftall signs it, a real citizen. There's one point that cuts through everything else. Citizenship comes from service. It is an action. It is not a status. You do not inherit it because of your religious beliefs. Jews answered the call, therefore they are citizens. Nothing else matters. As the historian Martha Jones has pointed out rather brilliantly, of course, citizenship is very tricky to define. Sometimes rights make citizens, and sometimes citizenship makes rights. But whatever is the case, Jews followed the line that sacrifice in wartime for liberty awards the status of liberty. Men and Measures, by contrast, follows the old anti-Semitic standby. Personhood and membership in the state comes from some kind of religious confession, and Jews can simply never have it. Moreover, the state has enemies that have to be cast out, of which the Jews are one. The most famous statement on Jewish rights in the early republic, that is to say, George Washington's 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, doesn't accept what Men and Measures had to say. It accepts what Levi Sheftall has to say. And I should point out, of course, in the debate between Men and Measures and Levi Sheftall, Sheftall's the winner. Georgia gets rid of its test oath by 1791. And George Washington follows the logic of Levi Sheftall. Washington writes his letter in 1790. He's addressing Moses Satius, brother of Gershom. Moses Satius is writing from the Newport Synagogue, asking Washington if Jews will have rights. Satius writes, deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, and lauding the military record of Washington, comparing him to David and Joshua. He asks whether Washington will recognize the rights of Jews who have been suffering with their fellow patriots in the field. And Washington follows the argument of both the Satius brothers and Sheftall, praising the Newport Synagogue and writing, all alike possess liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. Which is to say, the idea of religious freedom does not have to do in this country as much with the idea of tolerating, of sort of treating everybody real nice, but to the idea that each citizen has the right to choose for themselves how they are going to worship God, and that they cannot suffer civil disabilities because of that. It is a real shift from the pre-war situation where you do, where there is, again, there's some religious toleration, but primarily just among Protestants. It's a huge leap forward. Jews who could not serve in public office in 1775 are being elected to city councils in Virginia by 1795. So we actually do have that question that is posed to us in the days of the Revolution. Is this republic going to be bound by confession? Is it going to be bound by Christian oath? Is there a Christian element to the government, or is this a republic where one's loyalty to country is not bound by religious opinions? And over again, the answer is the latter. As religious institutions commit to the revolution, they become in some ways citizens of the state. Citizenship is in some way achieved through participation in the Revolutionary War, and this seems to be an approach shared by Jews, Catholics, Baptists, and potentially others. Obviously, this does not go to the many ways in which freedom did not expand during the Revolution. But I do think it is important that we take a moment to recognize that there is a way in which it does, that the revolution was not business as usual, that concepts of what is a citizen and what is freedom and what is religious freedom change and become law in the United States. It is important to notice the limitations and the difficulties of the revolution, but also its successes. Now, I do not think that our national conversation on religion and church of state is going to be transformed by this talk. If it does, I'd be real happy. But I do think we have a better chance of altering our discussions if we remember to make the revolution just a little bit more Jewish. By which I mean sort of thinking beyond an analytical term and thinking past belief or lack of belief as the driving question in our scholarship and in the narratives that we tell about the revolution. Instead, we might profitably think about the way in which religions, theologically and structurally, confronted and defined citizenship. Indeed, I was hit again and again researching this book, writing this book, that the question was not really, the question for Washington, the Revolutionary Army, and the early Patriot governments was not so much how do we protect Christianity? How do we express our religious faith? But rather, how do we get people of different religious faiths to work together towards this important common goal? How do we create religious citizenship? And I think that is no small accomplishment. Again, when we look back at it, it is an old saying, but it is one I like and one I'm going to stand by, which is to say, of course, that what the American Revolution represents is not a transformative second where suddenly liberty is created, but rather a reminder that liberty and freedom must always be created. They are not something we get and hang on to. They are something we build. They are something we live out in our day-to-day lives. And that, I think, is one of the lessons that we learn from looking at the Jewish patriots. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jortner. We will have a brief Q&A session. If I could kindly ask you to wait for the microphone, raise your hand, wait for the microphone so our friends on Zoom can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It was excellent. I can assure you that in my experiences pointing out the role of Jewish Americans in the revolution is still contentious with the sectors of the polity that you cite. But be that as it may, I do wish there's one subject you didn't touch on, which was, could you offer a few comments about the loyalist Jews and whether they had a coherent philosophy defending their choices? You know, the loyalist, for example, Episcopalians or Church of England folks, the Tory clergy had a very coherent vision of why they were where they were, particularly in New England, on the spectrum at that point. But do you have any comment on the loyalist Jews? Over.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that I don't intend this book, you know, I mean, this is a book that gets into. Will this book get talked about by you know people in Congress? Probably not, because we do go into a lot of details about Jewish funerary rites later in the book. I really need to be specific because there's a really interesting case, but blah blah blah. But this is not meant to be just a book for someone on one side of the political spectrum or the other. And again, my colloquial evidence has been the people who are most excited when I tell them about this are Jews and evangelicals. Evangelicals have been extremely fascinated about this, the idea that there are Jewish patriots, because they've never heard of it before. Are there Jewish loyalists? Of course there are. There are two, and I should preface this by saying, by and large, loyalist Jews don't leave as deep a mark in the documentary record, and American Jews already don't leave a really deep mark, so they're harder to find. Having said that, it seems my work indicated that there were more Patriot Jews than there were loyalist Jews, and this is particularly true in the city of New York. There's a very small group of Jews who remain in New York once Gershom Shashis moves out of it. and they actually have to get for their leader. They actually have to borrow one of the Hessians, a guy named Zunz. Hessian. He's selling goods. He's a merchant who travels with the Hessian soldiers, and he becomes the new president of the loyalist group. So they don't have a leadership structure there. And also worth pointing out that after the revolution, Zunz, along with many Hessians, says, well, I could go back to Germany, or I could stay here. And Gershom Satius actually says, why don't you join the board? So in the post-war world, again, they bring in this loyalist guy. The Episcopalians do this too. Anywho, there were not as many loyalist Jews, and they don't leave a much of a mark in the documentary record. For example, when Charleston is knocked over, there are a number of Jews who go ahead and sign a loyalty oath to Britain, but something like 12 of those 15 guys later escape. So again, that was a loyalty oath. They're like, yeah, and then they get out of there. Other questions?
One of the things that you also didn't touch on, and I thought you were going to do, is the whole question of Jewish participation in financing of the war. And my impression has always been that there were 4, 5, 6, 8 prominent Jewish merchants of some wealth that in fact loaned enormous sums for the revolutionary effort, some of which actually were never paid back, and that there were some Jewish wealthy people that actually ended up, dying in poverty. Could you touch on that for a minute?
Sure. Most people who loaned money to the U.S. government during the war did not get paid back. The story of Jewish financiers is there's a healthy bit of mythology that has been thrown into there. Again, in the 1930s, many Jewish historians and Jewish organizations promoted the myth of Chaim Solomon, again, in trying to create and sustain their vision of their Americanness, and to encourage the Roosevelt administration to stop the Nazi menace. They promote this idea of Chaim Solomon as the financier of the revolution. A lot of those stories have since been proven to be false. For example, this is one of my favorites. There's a story that I think it's George Washington really needs some money, and it's Yom Kippur. And so he goes to the Philadelphia synagogue. You can see how this is not really going to challenge some Jewish stereotypes here. But he goes to the synagogue and he says, Chaim Solomon, I know it's Yom Kippur, but I really need some money. And Chaim Solomon just goes around the synagogue and gathers up enough money and is like, here you go. And this gets published in books in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There are certainly Jewish financiers who loan money to the government. Solomon is one of them, although Solomon does a lot of other stuff. He works as a spy in occupied New York as well. There's a guy named Jacob I. Cohen who does that, which is simply to say some of the Jewish merchants who are operating in places like Philly and Charleston particularly do loan money to the Patriot cause. But what I really found is that the idea that the Jews are the financiers doesn't really hold up to, heavy interrogation. And when I looked at it, what I found was these are times when there are people who loan money and then they get promoted to sort of this founding father status. When I think much more significant are the military contributions and organizational contributions that Jewish patriot leaders offer.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I'm interested about the origin of where these Jews came from and how long they were in the United States. And let me just put it into context. I would think many of them showed up with the Dutch and wound up as merchants and urban people who facilitated trade between the Netherlands and the United States for a while. And also many of them may have been French who also had that relationship. And so later on, there are many others. But I would think that they would each start their own different congregations based on sort of how the patterns of Jewish temples were established in later years for the first and second generations.
So there's sort of two questions here, which is where do the Jews come from, and then sort of how do national differences express themselves in these congregations. Fascinating fact: the first Jews in what is today the United States don't start out in New York; they start out in New Mexico, because of course there are crypto Jews, that is to say, hidden Jews, is trying to escape from the Inquisition, who make their way to the Spanish possessions, particularly Mexico. And of course, the first Jews to show up in New York come from Brazil, which the Dutch had taken over briefly and had allowed. The Dutch allow for Jews to practice, the Portuguese do not. When the Portuguese recapture it, 1654, those 30 Jews head up to New York City. New York was not destined to be the great Jewish metropolis that it became. In fact, I will get this number wrong, but New York does not have the first synagogue in the New World. It has something like the 11th. There are synagogues in Jamaica, and there are synagogues in South America before there's a synagogue in New York. So a lot of the Jews are coming from elsewhere in the New World. They are mostly of Portuguese and Spanish descent, Sephardic descent. There are some Jews from England. Jews are allowed back into England under Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. When these Jews get together, of course, they actually, for the most part, join forces is maybe the wrong word. They don't create their own separate synagogues. There are usually different traditions represented in that synagogue. By and large, they use Sephardic rites, but it's not just Sephardic Jews who are in these synagogues. But of course, there are so few of them that they decide to join together. But also because in many places in Europe at the time, where Jews are allowed to practice, of course, the rabbis have full authority. The rabbis, in some way, are in control of the Jewish congregations and can impose what they want to see. And what it turns out in the United States, when the Jews are sort of free to practice and pick their own leaders, they sort of pick and choose for the most part. And indeed, the breaks between the Jewish synagogues, no American city has more than one synagogue before the Revolution. After the Revolution, we do begin to see synagogues begin to separate. But by and large, they're not separating on Ashkenazic Sephardic rite, not arguing about the liturgy. What they're really arguing about is things like, do we want to have a choir? How much of this is going to be in English anyway? Should we have, there's a very famous case in Charleston where there's an argument over, should there be an organ? Do we want to introduce, because organ music, not traditionally Jewish, do we install an organ? How much are we going to make our services look like Protestant services? And this sometimes causes divisions.
Wonderful talk. I was particularly taken by the significance you give to the falling of the test oaths in state after state, especially where there's a Jewish congregation. And I wonder if you would comment, you know that in the Constitution, in Article 6, Clause 3, there's a prohibition on religious tests. Until now, I'd only heard about it as for something said for Quakers and other Christian denominations. I wonder if you see significance in the constitutional prohibition of test oaths, significance for Jews.
So the question is, what about the Testo? There's a ban on religious test oath. No religious tests can be required of anyone serving in the U.S. federal government, according to the Constitution. And of course, one thing to remember is that this was not a case where all these different states get rid of their test oaths over the course of time. Certainly, the ban on test oaths in the federal Constitution is an encouragement to that. But there are two things to keep in mind. One is that the actual debates in Philadelphia about the Constitution regarding the test oath, there's just not a lot. We wish we knew more, but they didn't really think too hard about it. They were just like, "Yep, this sounds good. Okay, here we go." And again, it's a lot easier when you have, when you have 55 wealthy dudes hanging out. This is not a thing they wanted to talk about. I will sort of point out that there is an idea that the no test oath clause in Philadelphia had to do with differences between Christian denominations. I don't see any evidence for this, because, of course, if they wanted to have a generic Christian establishment, if they just want to say, well, it's Christianity, they could have done that. South Carolina actually does do that for a little while in the 1780s. They try to say, okay, our establishment is just plain old Christianity. And of course, the problem with that was then you got to define what that is. And they hem and haw, and they end up coming up with something which you're never going to believe this looks very much like what the Church of England believes. And that proves unworkable. And so they just get rid of it. They just get rid of it altogether. Certainly the federal ban on test oaths is probably an encouragement. But again, states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, which don't have a Jewish community after the war, they will keep their test oaths for well into the 19th century. But states where there are Jewish communities get rid of them.
Thank you for a great presentation. The Society of Cincinnati correctly never fails to mention that the American Revolution won by American as well as French soldiers and officers. The French soldiers and officers, there are more French soldiers and officers in the Battle of Yorktown than American soldiers. Actually, they landed mostly under the command of Rochambeau, General Rochambeau, who developed the right strategy to corner Cornwallis in Yorktown and so on and so on. No need to mention Marquis Lafayette, who was there from the beginning of the war. So with that, intuitively, the question is, were there any Jewish soldiers among the French regiments?
That I don't know. I know that there are a number of Jews of French extraction. No, that's not true. I know of at least one. There's a guy named Benjamin Nones who comes over to fight for the American cause, and then later sort of sticks around, becomes an important guy in the Philadelphia Synagogue. I cannot speak to that directly. It isn't. You may want to ask a French historian about that, because of course the Jews have not been emancipated in France during the time of the American Revolution, which is to say there are still Jewish codes in France, which mean that the French Jews do not have the same responsibilities or rights or privileges under the French monarchy as Christians. That's going to come with the French Revolution.
Thank you for your talk. So interesting. So what was lingua franca? How did they speak to each other? Was it English? Was it, I mean, clearly not Yiddish because some of them are Sephardic, but what was the language that they used to communicate with each other?
What a great question. This is the kind of question that historians this is the kind of question that people don't often think about, but man, is so interesting. So they spoke a variety of languages. Some of them obviously spoke Yiddish. A lot of them speak Spanish. It does appear that English becomes a preferred language in worship because it's something everybody kind of know. Again, they're living in a majority English-speaking colony. Therefore, whether you're worshiping in Spanish or Hebrew or Dutch, English can become the common tongue in and among the synagogue. So again, there's a reason why English becomes useful for Jewish worship in the early U.S.
All right, Dr. Jortner, thank you very much for coming out and speaking.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for attending in person and online, and for your continued support of our mission. A Promised Land, go out and buy it wherever major books are sold. Thanks again, Dr. Jortner. We appreciate it.
There's no better Christmas gift than a book about Jews and the Revolution.
Get home safe, everybody. Have a good one.